Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. This is the Center on Asia Globalization, which is part of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, NUS. We are a research center with the school. My name is Lena Ho, co-director of the CAG, Center on Asia Globalization. I'm also assistant professor in international affairs at the school. I work on Chinese politics and foreign policy. And today, it's with great pleasure that we have with us Professor Roselyn Hsueh to talk to us about her new book, which is called Micro-Institutional Foundations of Capitalism, Sectoral Pathways to Globalization in China, India, and Russia. Roselyn Hsueh is an associate professor of political science at Temple University. This is her second book. She is the author of, her first book is China's Regulatory State, a New Strategy for Globalization. So she has been involved in all this work on international political economy, globalization, comparative regulation and governance, states and markets interactions between them, and political economy of development. So she's very active in comparative political economy as well. So she is the recipient of many fellowships, prestigious fellowships for all the fieldwork that she has done. You can imagine for a book like this, Micro-Institutional Foundations, can you see that? Micro-Institutional Foundations of Capitalism, comparing across 3 countries, a very ambitious project. So one of the key things that Roselyn did in her book was to move from the very large undifferentiated picture of what we know about late developmental states, to understanding how, at a more micro level, how administrative capacity, different levels of state intervention actually is dependent on the strategic value of industry. So she tests her hypothesis across 3 countries, as I said before, China, India, Russia, and 2 specific sectors in each country, telecom sector and the textile sector. And she came out with a typology of market governance. Without much further ado, I'm going to ask Roselyn to speak to us for about 20-25 minutes. She has some presentation slides. Over to you, Roselyn.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Ho, for the introductions. It is my great pleasure to be here at the National University of Singapore, and thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm just grateful for this opportunity to launch my book here in Asia. This is my first time for this book doing a presentation here in Asia, and I believe Micro-Institutional Foundations of Capitalism is now available in Asia in all 3 formats. So paperback, hardcover, and through an electronic ebook, also through Cambridge Core. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I told Professor Ho that, so I am sharing a slide now. Can you see the slide? Okay, great. Thank you so much. As Professor Ho had introduced, this is my second book. My first book, China's Regulatory State, a New Strategy for Globalization, was really essentially the first book to identify China's strategic use of markets, strategic use of regulation. Essentially, in that book, I make the argument and really quite prophetically, in the sense that I identified that China had introduced competition, but quickly was able to in parallel re-regulate in ways that allow the Chinese government to advance industrial sectors and advance the national industrial base. And so this book, Micro-Institutional Foundations of Capitalism, in many ways builds on my first book and applies a theoretical framework that I had developed there, further builds on it and extends it to other countries and other sectors. And it is my great pleasure today to share with you the strategic value framework and to show you how the analytical and theoretical utility of the work and how it could help us understand globalization's trajectories in other countries and other sectors. In Micro-Institutional Foundations of Capitalism, I apply it to India and Russia. But in many ways, I argue that this strategic value framework could actually be useful for other countries and sectors in understanding this era of development. And so I begin with this idea that everyone assumes that there is a model to explain transition economies, right, in the context of global economic integration. And in our cases here, we have, Russia in the post-Soviet collapse, transitioning from a command economy to one that's more market-oriented. We have also India that was undergoing neoliberal transition, going from more of socialist institutions to the introduction of competition. So there's this economic transitioning going on, and there's this understanding that, of course, it's going to be a linear unitary globalization trajectory where you open your markets and countries engage in trade and open up for investment. It's going to be linear, it's going to be unitary, and we are going to see the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama famously had predicted. However, as I have found in my previous book, that in fact, that is not the case, and that that countries could, on one hand, globalize, but also re-regulate. But how do we understand that? How do we understand that across regime types, for example? Right? In my in this book, I compare China and Russia with India, which is a democracy. How can we, on the one hand, understand this introduction of competition, but re-regulation that occurs across regime types and across industrial sectors? What does this look like? And so what I do in this book is that I explore the analytical utility to study countries cross-regionally and to go to the industry and subsector, allowing me to uncover a new model of globalization. I compared these three countries because they are regional powers of comparable size, existing industrial bases, right? These are countries that have industrial trajectories that really began not just in this most early era of latest era of globalization, but there really have been other eras of globalization as well through other regimes, but really extending back a century or more. But in the most recent era, there have been similar timing in globalization. So that allows me to control for different levels of analysis. And I'm also controlling for systematic examination of labor and capital intensive industries, from textiles to telecommunications. So what are the research puzzles? The research puzzle, I see that my internet is a little unstable. I hope I can continue. China, India, and Russia liberalized their economies to join the World Trade Organization in the 1990s and beyond, to join the global economy. In the study of political economy and development and comparative political economy, we see that all three countries in globalizing in the era of neoliberalism is that they've departed from the East Asian developmental state, right? Singapore famously is also part of the East Asian tigers, this idea of state-led development. China, India, and Russia seem to have departed from that by liberalizing their economies and being more open, allowing foreign direct investment and engaging in trade in ways that departed from the East Asian developmental state. At the same time, these countries have also differed from the liberal policies of Latin America, right? That other iconic case of development where into a point where there's even a term for it. It's called Latin Americanization. This idea that states open their economies and allows in exploitation, the exploitation of the domestic economy and domestic institutions and society by foreign direct investment in coalition with domestic sector and sometimes even the state. So what we have is these three large countries globalizing in this era of globalization, but engaging in development that departs from these iconic models of development. And in fact, just to show you some data, in the 1980s, these countries were quite closed, right? It was before Big Bang globalization in 1990. So FDI is its percentage GDP quite low compared to Latin America, and even quite comparable to the other East Asian developmental states. But when we fast forward 15 years, we see that FDI as a percentage GDP, one measure of globalization, 3 countries have now exceeded the FDI's percentage of GDP of course, the East Asian developmental states, comparable to Latin American countries, including Brazil, for example, but even also the United States in terms of FDI as a percentage of GDP. So quite globalized is what I'm trying to get at for you. And this is 2014 figures, again, similar, that kind of departure from the East Asian developmental state as well as Latin America development models. If we take a longitudinal perspective, all 3 countries, globalized similarly around the same time in the early 1990s, and this most recent era, departed in terms of their trajectories in terms of extended in scope, but recently have also converged again in terms of FDI as a percentage of GDP. So looking across longitudinally, and if, obviously some of the ebb and flows have to do with the East Asian financial crisis, the global financial crisis in 2008, and so forth. And then also what I'm going to argue today, the strategic value orientation of these countries. Another measure of globalization is exports of goods and services as a percentage of GDP. And here we have a longitudinal perspective as well. And so we see these countries really to some extent quite comparable with each other as well. So what I'm trying to show you is that these countries are very ripe for trying to understand kind of the macro level and micro level connections of their globalization trajectories. So they have globalized similarly around the same time recently. They depart from these iconic models. And what I'm going to show you is that all 3 countries have re-regulated in ways that still, despite departing from these iconic models, that have departed from each other in terms of sectors within these countries, leading to quite distinct development outcomes. And how do we attempt to understand them? And by distinct development outcomes, one of my dependent variables in this book, aside from market governance, is that in terms of conventional wisdom, and if we take one measure of development outcome, science and technology patents, the conventional wisdom is that China outperforms the other 2 countries. And certainly on S&T patents, here we have a picture, if you take a longitudinal perspective, yeah, China outperforms India and Russia. But importantly, what I argue in this book is that we need to open the macro economy and take it to the industrial and subsector level. Once we do that, and here using a similar measure of S&T and patents, but now looking at the industry and subsector, we see that picture, that conventional wisdom of China outperforming Russia and India gets demystified, right? If we take it down to the subsector in telecommunications, one of the sectors I study, we see that in terms of telecommunication services, there are actually even variation in operations versus value-added services. And so it is quite important that we disaggregate the macro economy and take it to the micro industry and subsector. And so for the rest of the presentation, I am going to take the contextualized comparative sector approach and try to understand market governance patterns and also development outcomes. So the research questions: what is the relationship between internal development and integration into the global economy? How and why do state-market relations differ? And do these differences matter in post-Cold War era of global conflict and cooperation? I know that we will have more time in Q&A to go into the details, but before I do that, I want to just introduce to you upfront the key arguments of the study. I argue that market governance structures will mediate that relationship between globalization and development. The strategic value framework that I introduce in the book essentially theorizes how state elites perceive the strategic value of sectors, and they do so in response to internal and external pressures across time and across industries. And beyond that, we're going to see that sectoral structures and organization of institutions will shape these market governance structures. And the reason I zero in on sectors and sectoral structures and organization of institutions is that telecommunications is going to be telecommunications, textiles is going to be textiles, whether we are in China, an authoritarian regime, or in India, for that matter, a democracy, right? So these sectoral structures are going to have, what I was emphasizing is that strategic value framework allows us to examine both the objective factors as well as the intersubjective factors that orient elites, state elites, in terms of thinking about the strategic value of sector. And it's that this interacting logic of strategic value and sectors that will shape national and within country patterns of market governance. So the strategic value framework allows us to generalize, but at the same time, contextualize at the micro level on understanding what I identify as national configurations of sectors, which are essentially the micro-institutional foundations of capitalism, with implications for firm-level behaviors, with industry-level behaviors, and also development outcomes and global conflict and cooperation. And so in terms of how the strategic value framework gets contextualized at the country and industry levels, I make the argument in this book that techno-security developmentalism orientation shapes what I call bifurcated capitalism in China, which centralizes the governance of high-tech dual-use sectors and decentralizes labor-intensive, less value-added sectors. The strategic value framework allows us to identify what I call neoliberal self-reliance in India, which shapes bifurcated liberalism. There's a centralization of governance of small-scale rural sectors by, for example, the Ministry of Textiles, which essentially doesn't exist in the world anymore. But the strategic value orientation in India makes it so that there is a centralized governance of small-scale rural sectors, but highly liberalized and deregulated sectors in the high-tech, globally connected sectors. The strategic value framework allows us to identify what I call resource security nationalism in Russia that shapes a bifurcated oligarchy. These patterns of centralized governance in the infrastructural and resource sectors, and decentralizes labor-intensive, less value-added sectors that essentially has been liberalized since even before the collapse of the Soviet Union during the glasnost and perestroika era of Russia. And so what we essentially see in these national figurations of sectoral models are these micro-institutional foundations of capitalism that shapes now firm-level and industry-level behavior. So the study then contributes analytically by taking the study to sectors. It contributes theoretically by understanding the multidimensional impacts of sectors, allowing us to identify economic and political pressures, but also understand the intersubjective, ideational, and value-latent interpretations that state elites take to understand internal and external pressures. And then the study contributes empirically because we're able to identify case-specific findings and its relationship to development and globalization. I am able to understand the relationship between market governance and development outcomes at the industry and subsector level. And also, the book then have implications to understand global conflict and cooperation, whether it's about the trade, tech wars, info wars, also even how these countries have responded to the global pandemic. I'm happy in the Q&A to go into details on the implications for development outcomes and global conflict and cooperation. But now for the rest of the presentation, the few minutes I have left, I want to just share with you some empirical findings. But just for a moment, I want to mention that this study is with a comparative case research design at different levels of analysis. I process trace from sectoral origins to understand the evolution of the strategic value logic, the strategic value orientation from industrial origins to the most recent times. I look at also from 1980s to 2020. The different levels of analysis are the country, industry, subsector, and company levels. The study is based on semi-structured in-depth interviews, on-site field sites, visits in China, India, Russia, New York, Silicon Valley, and Washington, D.C., with key government, industry, company, and civil society stakeholders. Published and unpublished documentary evidence, bring together qualitative and quantitative data by national governments, industry associations, foreign delegations, and international organizations. Just a glimpse of the fieldwork. I have here images from fieldwork in 3 countries. We have a bookstore in Moscow that showing that, and also a bookstore in Wanfujing, and there's also an image of in Delhi, where we see that these countries are actually also very interested in each other, interested in the ideas and institutions that drive the state elites and also micro-level industry and firm-level actors in terms of, understanding how market governance patterns and how industries operate with each other. And so what I do is, the reason in terms of market governance on the dependent variable level, I look at market coordination, as well as the dominant distribution of property rights. And the reason I look at market coordination by state is because we needed to identify central level and a decentralized level and also mixed government authorities. And I look at the distribution of property rights because it's important to understand, who are the controlling interests, government or private stakeholders or mixed ownership. It's important to look at both the market coordination level as well as the distribution of property rights. And the reason it's important is because let's take an example of in China, Ant Group or Alibaba. On one hand, it is a private stakeholder, right? Not a state sector organization. But on the other hand, as we've known in most recent its state interventions, it's a sector that had previously been quite open, but because of re-regulation over time, based on strategic value orientations, we have the state intervening in market coordination, but at the same time allowing still property assets to be owned by private interests. Of course, state coordination and state intervention on the market level could be at the market corporate governance dimension. And as we've seen again with Ant Group, that state level intervention in market coordination had tightened, the ability for private property rights to enter markets, to the type of business areas, market segments that companies could get involved in, even the level of investment. And so just because a firm is owned by private interests, it doesn't mean that the state cannot intervene and regulate market entry, investment level, the ownership structure, and so forth. So all this to say is that it is very important to examine the dimensions of property rights as well as market coordination. And what I do is then I come up with a typology of market governance that then allows me to apply and look at market governance as a sector. I want to make a nod at common forces of change. In existing literature, there's a debate about open economy politics, subnational characteristics, historical legacies, the impacts of regime type, and of course, even global norms, markets, and organizations. What I argue in this book is that despite common forces of change that have impacted all sectors in these countries that I examined, but also in other countries in the world, we see national sector level differences. And it's a strategic value orientation interacting with sectoral structures and organization of institutions that I argue that allows us to better understand market governance patterns in these countries that are undergoing these common forces of change. And so a quick look at the strategic value framework at the objective dimension of the objective factors that drive state elites. We have political and economic dimensions, social and political stability, on the political level, economic dimension, how sectors contribute to the national technology base, economic growth and global competitiveness of the industry. These are also all going to be objective factors that will drive state elites. At the same time, I argue in the book, there's intersubjectivity in how state elites define, make claims on, and contest economic and political pressures that are going to be more subjective. And so, for example, if we look at the textile sector in India, it's a sector that has it very much contribute to the nationalist imagination of a cotton nationalism, and a very critical sector in terms of what mobilized Gandhi, for example, to make nationalist claims against British colonialism. And so as a result, the textile sector has been one that the Indian government has continued to regulate with central level, market level governance. Okay. I know I have a few more minutes left, so I'm just going to take the prerogative here to really quickly show you at the contextualized national and sector level on how the strategic value and sectoral logics interact. And so we have here in China, strategic are these sectors that have application for national security, contribution to the national technology base, and competitiveness of the domestic industry. And why is it that these are on the objective level, sectors are important? Because state elites are fixated on security factors that have been important to them since the founding of the People's Republic of China, right? Through the Cultural Revolution, Tiananmen Square incident, and then also even through on the economic level, the East Asian financial crisis and the global financial crisis, where security orientation and then also economic factors are really quite critical. And that orientation then gets applied at the micro-sectoral level. For India, strategic are these rural small-scale industries important for employment, objective factors, in infrastructural sectors due to sectoral conflict and so forth, in very multicultural, multi-ethnic India. But they're also at this intersubjective level, sectors that are associated with collective gain, associated with post-independence nationalist imagination as a function of Gandhian idea of Swadashinaism, of self-reliance in rural sectors. And And so objective and intersubjective orientation as applied to sectors. Russia, similarly, strategic sectors are of defense orientation, military and civilian networks, famously at the collapse of the Soviet Union, actually were never privatized or decentralized, contrary to the conventional wisdom of shock therapy, contrary to the conventional wisdom of privatization and massive liberalization. Because of Soviet strategic value orientation and also institutional legacies of examining telecommunication sectors as both security orientation, but not being able to disconnect military sectors from civilian sectors. So having these kind of path dependent, but also value latent effects of how these sectors apply to the strategic value orientation that have path-dependent effects today. And so this is how strategic value and sectoral logics apply in the strategic value framework to help us understand sectoral level and national level patterns of market governance today. Anyway, I will stop here and hopefully in the Q&A be able to answer your questions about industry and development outcomes and what all this may mean for global conflict and cooperation today. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Roselyn. I mean, in particular, I was particularly I find the slide on strategic value and how the three different countries actually define strategic value to be fascinating. Somewhat aligned to some of the things that perhaps I look at in terms of when I do my comparisons between China and India. How do countries prioritize where they put their resources in, right? Where they want to govern, and where they actually maintain oversight and control of. So it's fascinating how this interpretation of what is national interest is driving how the three different countries actually govern different sectors and different pathways to globalization. Fascinating account at a very sectoral level, which is very different from what the very broad kind of literature that we have on how states develop and how states globalize. But I have let me start by asking a couple of questions so that, I'll give the audience some time to think about the questions. It's a very dense, very, very technical book in a sense. Not that easy to understand, I have to say, Roselyn, when I read this book, it's not that easy for me to understand as someone who actually doesn't really work specifically on political economy. But very valuable, I think, because it's fascinating and highly relevant today as you look at these three big countries, and particularly as we look at China today, what's happening with Xi's policies. That's one of the questions I'm going to ask you in a bit. But let me ask you just specifically two questions related to what you have said so far. Have you looked beyond the telecoms and textile sectors, and how does your argument travel beyond these two sectors? I mean, obviously, you're not going to have to look at every single sector. That's just too much. But are there any other examples where how well your argument about the strategic value of these sectors actually travel? That's one question. The other one is how well does your strategic value framework travel to other countries? Are there, in East Asia countries or Latin American countries, do you find a similar phenomenon where governments have different varieties of governance, right, for different sectors, and based on this strategic value framework? So how well does it travel to other countries? These two questions first.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Ho. And I want to just make the comment that Professor Ho and I became acquainted with each other because of her fantastic book comparing China and India. So I was delighted when she invited me to be here today. So yeah, thank you so much for the question about the strategic value framework. One of kind of the motivations for me to established this framework is that I wanted to make it very relevant to help us in a way to be able to be generalizable, but at the same time allow us to come down and to understand kind of in a contextualized way how sectors could operate even within different kind of value orientations. And in terms of, well, how does this travel even just beyond the sectors that I study? One of the reasons why I chose telecommunications and textiles is, obviously, already these two sectors allow us to examine capital intensive and then also very labor intensive sectors. At the same time, these are huge industries, right? In telecommunications, we have manufacturing, we have services, but even within manufacturing, there are consumer-oriented sectors, handsets that are very different from terminal equipment that are much more high-tech and more infrastructural. And then on the textile side, conventionally it's a labor-intensive industry, but there are also technical sectors, man-made woven fiber, man-made fabrics, geosynthetics, right? The fiber that allows us to roll out bridges and roads. These are also textiles, but they're technical textiles. And so by looking at these industries, I then are able to exploit the analytical utility of the framework to see how does the framework then help us understand not just these capital intensive and labor intensive industries on the kind of more macro level for the industries, but if the framework could also apply to the subsector, then I'm showing the utility for the framework. And so let's take telecommunications and the differences even within telecommunications, right? With infrastructure sectors, we see that because national security factors are so important for China, for example, the government then retains state-owned property rights in telecom operations, right? And by doing so, then the government can shut down China Telecoms in Xinjiang or another province or another region whenever the government needs to, when there are protests or some sort of uprising of sort. But at the same time, by allowing them value-added service providers to operate freely for a long time, actually, on top of the state-owned operations. And this is where then we see subsectoral variation that the strategic value framework then allows us to exploit. Now, in the chat, there was a question about, well, there are cross-time differences, right? And even in these two infrastructural and value-added services, we see there may be differences of how the strategic value framework or orientation changes over time. And so then in the book, when I trace across time, I'm able to show that, yes, indeed, for a long time, value-added services operated freely on top of state-owned infrastructure. Right. But when responding to internal and external pressures of national level domestic political consolidation, for example, we see then the state at the market coordination level that began to crack down on even the value-added services that had for a long time been able to operate freely. And so that's just some example of how the strategic value framework can travel even within the broader sectors that of telecoms and textiles. And then quickly going to other countries. So I have papers, this one paper with a graduate student of mine where we apply the strategic value framework to Latin America, actually. And so the conventional wisdom, as I had mentioned, was that, Latin America, massive level liberalization, allowing kind of domestic level exploitation of FDI. But, once you even, open the macro economy and take it to the microsectoral level, we do see actually even differences playing out at the microsectoral level. So one country we look at is Peru. And so even among Latin Americanists, this is a country that has just essentially implemented shock therapy, right? Macro level, massive level liberalization. But by the strategic value framework actually then allow us to, once at the micro-sectoral level, to see that even at the micro-sectoral level, you actually do see re-regulation happening, and re-regulation based on the strategic value orientation of state elites, state technocrats, as they think about the importance of the sector at the subjective and objective levels in understanding the value of the sector for employment, of the agriculture and textiles, for employment, but really also for a country level ideas of the importance of agriculture, for example. So yes, the strategic value framework, I like to argue, could travel to other countries and even to other countries of that are economies that are much smaller. Now, of course, we want I do want to retain some humility in terms of kind of the scope of the scope orient conditions of the strategic value framework. So thank you very much.
So let me now turn to the audience, and I think you answered Adam Liu's question already, right? Adam is actually one of the professors at school. He was also he went to Stanford, and but I don't think you crossed years. But anyway, he works on political economy, basically on the banking sector. So that's Adam. I think you answered his question already. Let me ask the next question, which is, how does the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the increased political conflicts between China and the US are changing the approaches to globalization by these countries? So, how what's happening now in geopolitics and a trade war, technology war, are there any changes in how they approach globalization?
Yeah, thank you so much. So I make the argument in the book and really in the case chapters, but also in the conclusion, that the strategic value framework actually has analytical and empirical utility to help us understand what's happening today. And so thank you so much for the Russia question, because it allows me then to take a moment to think about the Russia cases. So by looking at textiles, this is a great example of how the strategic value orientation of resource security has applied to the sector level. So in textiles, I mentioned in the presentation, is a sector that really had been let go, even during the era prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So one of the first sectors to liberalize and privatize. And for decades, it's a sector that the Russian government had just kind of discarded. It was decentralized, deregulated to the regions. And it's really been the regional governors and also local level actors that have paid much attention to textile sector. And actually, to an extent, that it was a sector that was left to delinquish. So Russia, for example, has the largest apparel market, a high-end apparel market in the world, yet it doesn't have an apparel industry to tap into that market. But lo and behold, as state actors respond to internal and external pressures in the post-Crimea era, we began to see the strategic value orientation of resource security began to apply even to sectors like textiles that had been long decentralized, deregulated, and left to languish. And so what happened is in the post-Crimea annexation in 2014 and beyond, we began to see textiles sector associations and firms to take advantage of the sanctions environment, which of course now we know at that time that sanctions environment compared to what's happening today, there was actually very light sanctions. But to take advantage of some of the pressures that was globally to appeal to Putin and state leaders to apply import substitution industrialization policies to textile industry, and to begin to ask central level and regional level leaders to start subsidizing some of these sectors and firms in a sector that had long been left to languish. And this is particularly true in the technical sectors. And so up until very recently, in the past decade or so, it was actually multinationals like in the petrochemical sectors that have been dominant in Russia technical sectors. But in post-Crimea era, we began to see Russian petrochemical companies, along with oil companies that are state-owned and privately owned, asking for these ISI policies, and in collaboration with China, for example. So in the book, I tell the story of how Sinopec and the Silk Road Fund has, since the post-Crimea era, been working with Russian oil companies, both at the state level as well as at the regional and private level, to apply investments and then to also work closely in the technical sectors of textiles. And so this would be an example of where the resource security orientation in response to new internal and external pressures then applies to then the dominant patterns of market governance that we see today, even in a sector that had long been kind of in many ways decentralized and deregulated. So I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question in a sense relating to recent events, but looking more closely at China.
Yes, yeah.
You know, and I know that in your conclusion, there's actually a portion called Seize China, right? So, I mean, if you look at the events, the recent events in the past few months, zero COVID, the inward-lookingness of the turning inwards of the Chinese leadership in terms of economic development, and if FDI or other or multinationals are leaving China, what are the implications of these developments, and what was also put out there in the 20th Party Congress? What are the implications for China's globalization in the longer run? The priority that Xi is apparently giving to security matters, even at the expense of the economy. What are the prospects for private companies, for multinationals? What are we looking at right now?
Yeah, thank you so much for those questions, related questions. Before I begin answering those questions, I just want to point to an East Asia Forum piece, and then also a foreign policy pieces that I have written about some of these kind of in recent developments since 2020, really, also in telecommunications, that we see very clearly the state interventions that Professor Ho is referring to. And so that's in the East Asia Forum piece. And then in the foreign policy piece from last November, I examined and how the strategic value framework could be helpful to think about other sectors. And so I look at real estate investment and look at evergreen and why is it that even with these state interventions, why we hadn't seen that central level intervention in real estate development in the same way. That would be a sector where there are past dependencies over time and enough deregulation to the provinces and to the subnational level, where the central government, because there aren't any as much national security or national technological implications for the government to then apply central level intervention in those kind of sectors. But anyway, coming to some of the most recent development, I think one thing I wanted to say was that in my first book, I was able to identify that some of even these patterns or the strategic value framework really began and predates Xi Jinping. And so what we're seeing in a very real time and quite in your face state interventions really have been happening in the strategic sectors, particularly in telecommunications and finance, even in some sectors like automobiles, semiconductors, really since even when China entered the World Trade Organization in parallel with macro level market liberalization. And so in my first book, I identified that as liberalization two-step, meaning that we have market liberalization, but in parallel, this second step re-regulation. But what is true is that in 2013 and beyond, some of the state interventions that we're seeing is really happening even in some of the sectors that previously have been, the government have been more open to, right? And I think in telecommunications, it becomes really obvious. Right, I mentioned earlier, state-owned enterprises for operations makes sense, right? Wants to control infrastructure. Control information dissemination is important, but on the value-added services side, you could allow private actors to own those assets, but still control information dissemination because they operate on state-owned infrastructure already. And you could control business scope and even content without controlling property rights. But in the Xi Jinping era and beyond, many of the state level interventions are happening even at the more liberalized sectors of strategic sectors, right? And so certainly those, we're seeing a lot of that. And we are, and I think semiconductors would be a really prime example of that. Before 2013, semiconductors really was not necessarily seen as a state sector. Right. And in fact, SMIC, which I write about in the book, began as foreign direct investment. Mm-hmm. For those who have been following the semiconductor industry, SMIC was FDI. It was FDI in 2000 when it first entered China in collaboration with a subnational government, an important subnational government, the Shanghai government, in collaboration with some stakeholders on the industry level, and also even with a professor at Beida University. So it was FDI. It was Asian capital, but it was not Chinese capital. It was, and so, but over time, through corporate governance interventions, through the 2000s, and this was before Xi Jinping, but through the 2000s, corporate governance interventions, over time, SMIC became more and more state-owned, and to a point where today, SMIC is referred to in the Xi Jinping era as a state-owned enterprise, and as an example of how China was able to grow the semiconductor industry. But the reality is, it was the strategic use of markets, strategic use of introduction of competition, allowing FDI to come in as technology transfers and to over time dilute some of the FDI equity and in the important sectors. But at the same time, you still see a very large part of the economy that is still privately owned, and a very large part of the economy in the non-strategic sectors where subnational governance still is important and will continue to be important. And that's why I have identified what I call bifurcated capitalism in China.
Awesome. Just one last question, another very good question from Federico Jensen. It's a follow-up question to his previous question. How would the strategic value framework be applied to key sectors in high-income countries in Europe and North America, given they also seem to be moving towards a more state-regulated economic model?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Now the question is for those developed economies, not the Latin American ones.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I would love to see the strategic value framework to be applied to the advanced democracies and advanced economies. And so it's a shout out to those who might want to use the framework to think about it. So the framework has two parts, right? It has the strategic value orientation, but it also has the sectoral structures and organization of institutions. And so the legacies of how industries are organized and the sectoral structures will also be important. But in terms of the strategic value orientation, I think the framework could allow us to think about what are some sectors that objectively could be important to countries, and it doesn't have to be developing economies, right? And it doesn't have to be, even these large regional powers that I look at in the book. And so, take United States, for example. It's a country that it has, famously in the Varieties of Capitalism literature, is identified as a liberal political economy. And so it has a liberal political economy orientation. And so obviously there are going to be institutional legacies to that, where it's traditionally they're just going to be more stakeholders and more decentralized and liberalized markets. But as state elites address and respond to internal and external pressures, we are going to see governments identify sectors that are going to be important, that will contribute to, the national technology base and maybe even national security concerns and orientation. And lo and behold, we do see the federal government, President Biden, for example, and really this predates even Biden during the Obama era and into Trump era, where certain sectors become more important as they are, competing with on the global level with, countries or international competitors like China. Now, of course, we've seen different administrations in the United States, whether Democrat or Republican, respond to some of those objective pressures differently, right? Either with a more bilateral, more protectionist approach, or a more multilateral, more liberal approach. So there may be different kind of tools in the toolbox. But the strategic value orientation, it's a state elites respond to internal and external pressures, could be identified with the framework. And of course, we need to think about existing institutions and how that might interact with the strategic value framework. And so for even Biden, for example, where we have, increasingly more of an industrial policy, but because the United States is a liberal economic model, the federal government will have to fend with, different levels of stakeholders in the more liberal economic model. And so the institutional legacies with that. And so ultimately, what the United States industrial policy will look like, rhetoric aside, it will be one where it will have to incorporate a lot more stakeholders at different levels, at the states level, at the firm and industry levels, in a way where a regime type like China will it will look very differently. So there will be different types of industrial policies that will continue to exist in the world, even as we see industrial policies in response to internal and external pressures.
Very fascinating. So I think we are actually on time already at 9:31. Thank you so much for your time, Roselyn, and thank you for all the audience for all your attention and for questions. Now, this is a really, I'm trying to show it, a really wonderful book, very well researched. I mean, it's extremely challenging to compare China, India, let alone China, India, and Russia. So a very important book to understand how, pathways to development, pathways to globalization, and the different types of varieties of market governance, as we understand in terms of state intervention, industrial policy type that we are witnessing today. So very relevant for the world today as well. Thank you so much for your time. hope you enjoy, and have a really good day, rest of the day. This is very early for Professor Hsueh here, so we really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Roselyn, and hope to see you again very soon. Thank you, audience. Thank you for questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming online. Thank you very much.